Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate, and this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking. This episode is number 173, and I'm so proud of all the pod episodes that are out there for you to listen to. Everyone, in my opinion, a gem. What you won't have heard are the ones I record and then don't manage to get edited and out into the world. Sometimes, as I heard someone put it recently, life gets lifey and something has to give. And I confess there's more than one episode recorded on my laptop that has never made it to listeners' ears. One such, long delayed, is this non-fiction special. Never apologise, never explain, said Julia Child. And so, instead of presenting you with a list of excuses, it is instead with delight that I finally present you with this episode, in which frequent podcast Phil Chaffee and I celebrate the world of non-fiction, inspired by a book we both loved, Carmageddon by Daniel Knowles. Phil read it first and flagged it up as one of his favourite reads of the year. I trust few things more than a Phil recommendation, so I read it too, loved it, and programmed it for the podcast book club, where it made for fascinating discussion. But wanting to give you more than just one book recommendation, we're broadening it out to include some other non-fiction reads we loved and couldn't stop talking about. So let's get to it. I just wanted to mention that this was recorded some time ago, as some of the references aren't quite bang up to date. Okay, here we go. At a time in which digital information is increasingly uncertain, it feels more essential than ever to engage with books that tell us about the world, diversify our perspectives, and propose solutions for change. And yet, I have a feeling I'm not alone when I admit that sometimes these books can feel a little homeworky. After a long day at the office, a book about politics or financial systems is probably not what you're going to want to sink into on your commute home. And if you do your reading last thing at night before going to sleep, it seems unlikely that that book about climate change is going to appeal. And yet, books that increase our understanding about the world can feel empowering. Climate change feels a lot less terrifying if you read a book by an expert who argues that there is still hope. And some writers are so good that no matter what the subject is, you find yourself engaged and even entertained along the way. Regular guest, journalist and prolific reader Phil Chaffee joins me today to talk about the non-fiction books that impacted on us and which we passed on to others. And we're bringing you our interview with the author of the book that prompted the idea for this special episode, Daniel Knowles, and his book Carmageddon, How Cars Make Life Worse and What to Do About It. All that coming up here on the Book Club Review. Hey Phil, when the evenings draw in, do you find yourself thinking, what I really need is a good reading light?
Do I ever?
Well, you're in luck, because it just so happens that this episode is sponsored by serious readers who make the best lamps.
What's so good about them?
These lamps feature daylight wavelength technology, which replicates the daylight spectrum, a sciencey bit which is to do with the fact that our eyes don't get the light that they need because under most artificial light you don't get the full electromagnetic spectrum that our eyes evolved to function with. And so basically under most artificial light our vision is compromised. Now, I don't really know about all that. All I know is that from the very first moment I tried one of their lights, I noticed how much easier it was to see, as if there'd always been this slight unconscious effort going on, and suddenly my eyes could relax. I've got a desk lamp, which is beaming over me now, and I've got the floor lamp by my bed, and I couldn't live without either of them. I find they help me read more, and they help me concentrate better, which is just as well, as I've got this big pile of non-fiction books to get through.
I could use one of these things.
Well, listeners, if you're interested to try them, I have a special offer for you. Visit seriousreaders.com/BCR and use the code BCR at the checkout for £150 off any HD light, and you'll get free delivery. I'll put the link and details in the show notes, or find them on our episode page at thebookclubreview.co.uk. Let us turn from lamps that help us concentrate to the books that we are concentrating on. Phil, you often bring up non-fiction books on the podcast, so I know that you read both fiction and non-fiction fairly interchangeably, but is there a particular mix? Is it more of one than the other? How does it work out for you?
I think it's definitely more fiction, probably like a third non-fiction to two-thirds fiction. But, you know, given how much I read, that's several dozen nonfiction books a year. I love history, so I love to read a lot of history. I also love, particularly with audiobooks, I love listening to memoirs. And then I try to stay current with other things and current affairs and sort of journalistic things. I'm pretty bad on a lot of nature stuff, sciencey stuff. I could be better at all of that. How about you? What's your mix?
I think it's probably, I want to say 50-50. It's funny because when I was thinking about nonfiction, I was thinking a lot of the books that I've really loved tend to be biographies or memoirs or more books about people than I was trying to think of more fact books that I'd really enjoyed. And I remembered the Mushroom book, Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life, which I really loved. But yeah, I found myself struggling slightly. And biography and memoir, of course, are nonfiction. But I almost thought for the purposes of this discussion, I feel like it should be a bit more straight fact books. We've just been reading nonfiction for the podcast book club. We read Humanly Possible by Sarah Bakewell, which is a really interesting, engaging history of humanist philosophy, going right back to the earliest philosophers who you might describe as humanist, tracking the shared concerns that humanists have held throughout the ages. It was an absolutely fantastic read. But one thing that troubled me as I was reading it was the feeling that I wouldn't remember it. And then I was pulling down, any listener to the pod will know this is a book that I regularly cite as one of my favourite nonfiction reads. It's by Pierre Bayard and it's called How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read. It's a very engaging series of little essays making this argument that actually it's perfectly fine to talk about books whether you've read them or not. And it fell open at this page and it said, reading is not just acquainting ourselves with a text or acquiring knowledge. It is also, from its first moments, an inevitable process of forgetting. Do you feel you remember the things that you read, or does it trouble you that you'll get really immersed in a nonfiction book but then it evaporates afterwards?
I mean, I definitely feel like so much of what I read is in one ear at the other. And I can very pleasantly read a thriller that I've read 5 years before and be completely surprised again because I've forgotten everything. I still do think even with both fiction and nonfiction, it is a bit accretive. And even if you forget 90% of what you've read, something's going to stick, hopefully. I do feel like my body of knowledge does build out. Do you agree? Is that how you function?
I mean, it's funny. It's just in that way that you have the thought and then it continues to percolate. And as we were discussing the Sarah Bakewell last night, I was lamenting the fact that I felt that even as I was reading it, I was already forgetting the majority of it. And yet I found myself thinking, but this conversation and the things that we've talked about will be the things that I remember, even when we're not consciously remembering all of the facts and things that we've read. The magic of the Sarah Bakewell book is that I feel like without necessarily spelling out really clearly what humanism is or what it is to be a humanist, by the end of the book, because it's written in what you come to realize is a humanistic way, you take on that mindset and that worldview, and then it leaves you with this sense that in conversations you might be having with people, you suddenly notice, oh yes, that's a humanist philosophy or little echoes of it. And I think it's that. Subconsciously, I think that things do affect you. And then when you then translate that into your conversations you're having and your view of the world, these things percolate in.
Yeah.
Perhaps it all goes in somehow.
Well, and also particularly the ones that really grab you. This is Carmageddon. This is a lot of the best nonfiction really grab you. They're the ones you force into other people's hands, and they're the ones that you're constantly thinking about. And there are books I am thinking about years later just because they got it. You know, I read plenty of books that I forget them next week, but the really good ones stay with you.
Well, I'm looking forward to coming on to Carmageddon, but I thought it would be fun before we come on to that to have a think about some of the other books that we've read that we feel fall into that category. I'm dying to know what books you've come up with.
I will start with Putin's People by Catherine Belton. Is this on your radar at Arcade?
Well, I remember there was a point where it seemed very relevant and it was definitely being written about when the Ukraine conflict kicked off.
Yeah, and it came out right around then. I think it might be it's a 2020 book, actually. But Catherine Belton was the Moscow bureau chief for the FT. And so she covered this. She is an amazing reporter, and she spent years reporting this book, which then got a lot of headlines because after it came out, some of the Putin's people, it's about Putin, but it's also about all of the spies and power brokers within Russia, but also the oligarchs who have advanced Putin's agenda in the West and particularly in the UK. And given the difficult UK libel laws, she had to fight some very intense court battles after the publication of this book, but she did push back on them. It's just this, I mean, I have pushed this into hands just because it really, I mean, A, helps you understand what's going on right now, but helps you sort of frames a lot as what has gone on for the past 30 years in Russia, in Europe, around the world. It's a page turner. It's lots of pulpy spy stuff, lots of pulpy geopolitics, but it's not a flimsy book. It's very substantive. It's very convincing, and it's just really, really good journalism. And I have pushed it into a lot of hands, and it really has shifted how I've thought about things.
I was thinking about how one of the things I really love about nonfiction is often the pleasure comes from the sense of the author's mind at work.
Yeah.
It's great to learn about the world and find out lots of information, but the pleasure, I think, kicks in from that sense of the person telling the story. And I think that's why I enjoy nonfiction so much, because I feel like you get that in a very pure form.
Yeah.
You know, you're reading someone's thoughts and how they've put this information together. It tells you a lot.
What have you been pushing into hands?
I wanted to talk about the book that I'm reading currently, because I feel like it's the book that I just keep telling people about. And I felt a little bit on the back foot when I discovered it, because it's been a Sunday Times bestseller. I think it was hugely successful in the author's native Spain. It's been around for a while, and I only picked it up. I came across a secondhand copy in a bookshop over the summer, and idly, because it was like sort of £2, picked it up. And I started reading it. And immediately I was like, oh my God, this book is so good. It's called Papyrus, The Invention of Books in the Ancient World, by Irene Vallejo. And she is basically giving you a history of books as they exist today. So from the earliest development of writing and how that then came gradually through different forms of technology. Like first they were writing on tablets, and then Egyptians invented parchment and they wrote on that. And then we in Europe came up with calf skin and vellum and had that. And so just this physical act of these books being made, like the first part is that. And it talks about libraries. Alexander the Great was obsessed with building this library and collecting all these books. And the earliest bibliophiles, people who would go to extraordinary lengths to copy these manuscripts so that they could add books to their collection. I think what I love about it is it could be dry. You would think that could be dry. And this is so not that. It's absolutely electrifying on every page. And it's one of those books where it's really hard to say why. Like, why is this so good? I know that it's good. I know that it's good. But it is a kind of magic. And I think it's just that she is so warm and engaging in the way that she's telling the stories. And you sense her enjoyment on every page of just how fascinating it all is and how wonderful to be able to read about it, or, in her case, write about it, but for you to read about it. I think you share in the pleasure. I haven't finished it yet. I'm still working through it, but I have recommended it to people, and a couple of people who I've recommended it to have come back to me to say, this book is so great.
I'm sold.
So,
This sounds really up my alley.
It's really great. How about another one from you?
Yeah, so many options. I could go on for hours. One book I read 2 years ago, maybe. It came out 3 years ago. It's called Invisible Child by Andrea Elliott. This came out in 2021. She was possibly still is, a New York Times reporter. And she was doing a story about homelessness. And she was at this homeless shelter in Brooklyn and interviewed, and then was really smitten as a journalistic subject with this girl at the time named Dasani Coates, who was homeless, living in this shelter with her mother and her many siblings. Dasani was just like real presence, this brilliant girl, very communicative, a fascinating interview subject. And Andrea Elliott, the reporter, then followed Dasani over the next decade. It's interesting because she was doing it in real time, so she was writing further follow-up articles in the New York Times about Dasani, and that then changed Dasani's profile, and politicians started to hear about Dasani. So Dasani's life changed partially because Andrea Elliott was writing about her, but it was still a very rough life. And what she documents is Dasani and her mother and broader family and their interactions with not just the homeless system, but the criminal justice system, the mental health systems, and this is all New York institutions, but it also feels like you could have a version of this book in London or a lot of other places. I mean, it's beautiful because you get to really know these characters. She goes into the history of the family. You really get to know the parents, Dasani's siblings, but it's also this crazy, infuriating book when you see how they're just falling through the cracks of these systems. And if there was any sort of coordination, or if the public just gave them the money to live, gave them a house, it would solve so many problems. But struggling through the educational system, the homeless system, and the criminal justice system, it's just this infuriating, but also just very important piece of journalism. And this I have really, because we are all walking past homeless people if you're living in a big city all the time. And it is, I think, really important to really get a sense of this other world that is there and how complicit many of us are, not necessarily personally, but structurally, and our government in failing these people.
Does it leave you then with the feeling that there's something that you can do? Or because I feel like that sounds like it would be quite a hard read in some ways.
I mean, I think the changes are structural. I hope this has inspired people to go out and really make structural changes, politicians, but also social workers and others. But it's not a hard read. You know, I tore through it. It's cinematic almost, because she's basically there over Dasani's shoulder as Dasani is growing up. And you really get this sense of place, but also of, I don't know. It doesn't sound like, who wants to spend, it's a hefty book too, who wants to spend all that time just reading about homelessness, but it is rewarding. And you come out, I don't want to give away where it goes, but it's not necessarily a really happy story or a really sad story. But you come away really engaged, I think.
And it sounds like, as you say, that after you've read it, you see the world a little bit differently. Yeah. And I always love books that do that. Books that change you slightly. They're the books.
Do you have another?
The reason I sort of was like, it sounds like it might be a bit depressing, but only because I think there is this thing as well that we resist reading books that we feel are going to upset us. Yeah. For understandable reasons. If you're worried about climate change, why would you seek out and read a book about climate change? But the thing about that is, increasing your knowledge and understanding helps you with the sort of anxiety spirals and feeling terrified of things without fully knowing the facts. And I think when you are better aware of the facts and understand the facts better, it's empowering because you're much better placed to make sensible decisions and lobby for change from this place of knowledge and understanding. So the reason I keep coming back to this is because I've got this book, Not the End of the World, by Hannah Ritchie, How We Can Be the First Generation to Build a Sustainable Planet. So this is almost the opposite of the books about climate change that we're generally used to, which are very much, these are all the problems, how are we going to solve them? Not hand-wringing exactly, but just I think there's been a lot of work done that is scientists just trying to get people to take it seriously and trying to alert the world to how serious this is. The interesting thing about Not the End of the World is that Hannah Ritchie isn't trying to minimize that or say that it isn't a problem, but she is looking very carefully at the statistics. And her argument is, yes, these problems are huge and very serious, but that it is not too late for us to address them. And then she takes you through various things that have been happening in the world that are making change, measurable change, and things that could potentially bring more benefits, things that people can do as individuals, things that we can lobby for change from our politicians. It's just a very different book about climate change because when I was reading it, I didn't feel terrified and depressed. I felt encouraged and hopeful that there are things that we can do to address this problem. And I think her biggest point is when we feel terrified and depressed, we're not going to do anything. There is this hopelessness that sets in when we feel like there is no hope, right? Obviously. And that's the biggest problem of all. If we all feel there's nothing to be done, that is the end. And so this is very much a book about saying, no, look at these positive things that are happening in the world. And what can we do to focus on change? And the only other thing I'd say about it is I think having children, this is something that as a parent kind of keeps coming up. It's hard to know what to say to them about the world because part of you wants to shield them from all terrifying, awful things. And another part of you is just like, well, they have to know, you can't not tell them. And I have found this book really helpful in having conversations with them about things that I know that they are worried about. They were talking about climate change in their school, and they got them to watch the film The Day After Tomorrow, which understandably freaked them out. I wouldn't show The Day After Tomorrow to a class of 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds. But then what was good was that I felt I was able to have a conversation with them about, Hollywood and drama and disaster movies and contextualize that. But then also, thanks to Hannah Ritchie, able to have a conversation with them about some things that were going on in the world that will hopefully mean that that doesn't happen. So, yeah, I think this is a really important book that I hope lots of people will read, even though it's got lots of graphs and charts and it seems quite sciencey and it's about climate change. So for lots of reasons, I feel like people might not rush to read it. But when you actually read it, it's a book that makes you feel better. And I love that about it. I think it's great. Tell me about another one of yours.
Sure. I've been giving you a bunch of contemporary books about the modern world. I feel like one of the ways I use history is as escapism. Launch me into a completely different world where I do not have to worry about climate change and homelessness and Vladimir Putin. And one that I just was absolutely delightful from a couple years ago is Amy Stanley's book, Stranger in the Shogun City. She's a historian, I'm not actually sure where. This is a book about, it's a biography basically of this unknown woman named Tsunero. It's all set in the early to mid 19th century while Japan was still closed off. So just before Commodore Perry came in 1854 or whenever it was. And then the Meiji Restoration happened and Japan opened up. But this is the world before that. And this follows this woman from a little village far away who then travels to Edo, which is the city that burned down and then was rebuilt as Tokyo, which was the capital of the shogunate, even if the emperor didn't live there, the shogun did. This is basically just a portrait of her life, but it's also this glorious portrait of what Edo might have looked like at the time and might have felt like. And there's a map of what it was, but you just get this sense of this living, breathing world of Edo. Is this
the floating world in all those Hiroshige woodcut prints?
Yeah, so Hiroshige is like a great reference point. It's the exact same era that he did his 100 Views of Edo, the paintings of Edo. It's not quite the floating world, although that is sort of there. It's much more just sort of the actual, she doesn't have a great life and she really struggles, but she bops around from different places in Edo and you get a sense of the different gardens and palaces, but also just how, it was a very densely populated city and how rough and tumble it was in places. But yeah, I think Hiroshige, that's the vibe. Think those paintings and you've got this. There's not a ton of plot. There is, you follow her life basically. And obviously...
But she was a real person.
She was a real person.
Yeah.
And there's documentary evidence, which is what prompts this book, this trove of writings, diaries and things that Stanley uses. It's a way to jump into a completely different world. It's also a nice follow-up if you enjoy Shogun, the TV show or the book. That's the opposite earlier end of the shogunate. It's just a nice form of escapism. Nonfiction can be escapism too. It can launch you into completely different places where you don't have to think about the worries of today.
Yeah, that's true. I was thinking, people say they don't like nonfiction. It's almost like someone saying they don't like fish, which is fine. But there's so many different kinds of fish. Canned tuna is nothing like, a sort of beautiful piece of roasted salmon or whatever. There's so many different kinds. Okay, let's turn to Carmageddon, where earlier in the year, you and I sat down with Daniel Knowles, soundtracked faintly in the distance by London traffic for me, the hustle and bustle of New York City street sounds for you, and the odd L train rumbling behind Daniel from his home in the suburbs of Chicago.
I'm a reporter for The Economist magazine, and I have been doing that for about 11 years now. I've lived all over the world, in Nairobi, in Mumbai, in Washington, D.C., and now in Chicago as well as London. And I have always been a reluctant driver. I only learned at the age of 26, and I've always been interested in how cities work, the economics of transport and of land use and of planning. And living in all these different places, I became obsessed with how we get around and how we designed our cities that affect the world and the decisions you make. When I lived in Nairobi, I owned a car and drove everywhere, even though most people in that city can't afford to drive. And my life was entirely defined by traffic. When I lived in Mumbai, I had a driver and tried not to use him. Here in Chicago, I try not to drive. The reason I wanted to write this, it brought all of it together. It seemed like the dominance of the car in cities all over the world. It's something that's almost universal and become so normalized that we don't even think about it. And yet it really affects how we live all the time. The way our roads are built, the way in which we incentivize or disincentivize the use of cars, how public transport works. It's all linked together. So I became obsessed with cars and why cities are built the way they are and why you have to have one in so many parts of the world and how we got to that. And then in the pandemic, was sat at home, relatively quiet, didn't have all that much work to do. The streets for once were, I was living in London at the time, were incredibly quiet. And I moved to Chicago and that's when I started writing a book. I felt like this would be great. Why didn't we all have fewer cars? Why didn't I make the case for it?
The word I keep using when I'm talking to people about it is revelatory. It just felt again and again there were things that I'd known and lived with all my life suddenly being presented to me in a way where I was, oh my God, seeing them in a different light. So I love that about it. I'd love to share a bit with people. I wonder if you could read a little section for us just so we can get a bit more of a sense of it.
Sure. So I picked out a bit from the introduction. We have designed our cities so that having a car is not a luxury, but a necessity. Car drivers are given privileges such as free parking and free road space. While housing costs more and more, people still expect to be able to leave their car anywhere for a pittance. To live a normal life in many of the world's cities, you do not want to own a car, you need to own one. And to create enough space for all of the cars, our cities are spread out so much that the distances you have to travel are simply too far to be practical by any other means other than in your own personal vehicle. People visit older cities, places like Venice and Amsterdam, and marvel at the fact that you can walk everywhere. I think it's magical. But then they go home and they get back in their cars. A study of American cities from 1980 to 2000 found that a 10% increase in the amount of road space led to a 10% increase in the amount people drive. You cannot solve congestion by giving away valuable land to cars. You will just end up with more cars. We've gotten so used to the domination of cars that we've forgotten how unpleasant the consequences are. We talk about traffic like we talk about the weather, as though it is something natural, outside of our control, to complain about but not to fix. We call car crashes accidents, as though they are not preventable. We shrug at pollution, even though it leaves our children coughing up their guts in PE. One 2019 study showed that living next to a main road stunts lung growth in children by 14%. And I can keep going if you like.
I think even in that little bit you read, I had the usual reaction I always had, which is just, oh my goodness, yes. When I read something and I go through and I have pages that I want to remember something or there's something I feel is significant, I fold the corners. This book looks like a hedgehog because it's got so many folded corners. I wanted to do something quickly that probably will make you wince because I'm going to pull out a few things out of context, out of the very nuanced arguments that you're building, but just to give people a sense of how rich this is and how full of ideas. These are my folded corners. A Swedish study found that people who commute for more than 45 minutes by car are 40% more likely to divorce. That Ubers increase the traffic problem because most of the time they're just driving around waiting for fares. That in America, land of the free, the crime of jaywalking was invented in Los Angeles in 1925 to stop people from walking across streets where they might be hit by cars. That outside of Houston, Texas, there is a freeway 28 lanes wide. That in Sao Paulo, the traffic is so bad the richest get around by helicopter. Electric cars are popular precisely because they provide an excuse to avoid doing harder things, like rebuilding our cities or changing the habits of lifetimes. Persuading people to switch from their old petrol car to a shiny Tesla is much easier than persuading them that they can live without a car. That if you build protected bike lanes, which cars cannot enter, people will use them because they feel safe. The problem is not cars themselves, it's privileging cars over any other form of transport, so that they are not a luxury or an occasional necessity, but rather something we are forced to rely on day to day. Americans spend only a little less on buying and running their cars than they do on housing themselves. If we did not need them as much, we could have a lot more left over to spend on whatever we want. And then broader themes. There's a very interesting chapter on the way that car ownership has impacted Black communities and accentuated racism. There's another one that I found really distressing on cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and how a country that ought to be one of the wealthiest in the world is being ruthlessly exploited for profit because we need this material to make these batteries. There's so much, and I wanted to give a little bit of a sense of all of these fascinating details. But I'm going to hand over to Phil and let him ask you a question.
Yeah, I think Kate highlighted a lot of what I loved about this too, which was these facts that force you to reframe how you view the world. Thinking about jaywalking, the pedestrian experience as being just a tag-along to cars. So much fascinating stuff about the history, everything about how we structure our society. And I wonder if, as you reported this book, if there was anything for you that you found particularly completely reframed the world for you.
There was a lot. I think some of it came earlier than when I started reporting the book. The stuff that really surprised me, even though I had a sense of it when I came to write the book, but digging into it and doing the research, was quite how aggressive the sort of process, the political process of rebuilding cities deliberately to make them usable by car drivers at the expense of everybody else was, and how controversial that was, and how it happened and how it continues to happen in cities in the world where people are only now beginning to get rich in large enough numbers to own cars, that you have the driving of new highways through slums, that sort of thing. This determination of what land should be for and why land should be used for roads and parking spaces rather than for people. It's still going on. So I think that was probably the thing that the depth of it that was new to me, that I didn't expect in a way when I first started writing the book to be such a big part of it, how much of a choice it is and why different places have made that political choice to essentially prioritize driving and one person being in their car as the primary way of getting around. Because you have this idea that somebody invented the car and then Henry Ford made it cheap and then everybody got one. But it wasn't as simple as that. For everybody to get one, it did require this really radical rethinking of what streets were, what cities would be like, how roads were. All these rules had to be invented.
It's really fascinating. And I didn't realise when car culture started to take hold here in the UK that there was such a strong opposition to it. There was a whole movement of people vehemently opposed to it. You don't really ever hear about that story. So that was another page, another folded corner. There's so many ideas in here, looking back to the past and exploring how that infrastructure came to be. And then you're looking ahead to the future, and you spend a little bit of time on Elon Musk and his vision of self-driving cars in tunnels. I was really fascinated by the idea of bionic duckweed, which was not a term I'd come across before. Could you explain about that a bit and why it's very unhelpful?
Bionic duckweed was this idea, I think originally came from a railway engineer who was giving evidence to Parliament in the UK 15 years ago, something like that. But the idea is basically that there's going to be this technology that's just on the horizon that will change everything. And so it's not worth spending money now on fixing a problem because this new technology will come along and fix it in the future. So the literal bionic duckweed, the engineer who's talking about this was saying how politicians had not spent the money to electrify the railways. If you run electric trains, they're more efficient, they're better for the environment, but it's very expensive to build all that infrastructure. And the idea of bionic duckweed was, maybe somebody will invent this bionic duckweed that allows us to make cheap hydrogen that we can power our trains with. And so we don't need to electrify it, so it will be wasted. And I think once you have that idea in mind, you can see in so many cases in which a technology which maybe is real, maybe exists, but the possibility of it is used as an excuse, weaponized by the political opponents of some sort of investment project to stop it happening. So we have it with self-driving cars, we have it with a lot of electric cars, and with Elon Musk with tunnels, this idea that will invent ways that will solve our transport problems that don't mean having to have fewer cars or having to get rid of our cars. That's the context in the book, but I actually think it goes a lot beyond this kind of transport policy. There's so much of it everywhere, bionic duckweed.
Absolutely. One of my favorite chapters in this book was your chapter about Tokyo, which has, I think, globally the lowest car usage in the world. I think you have the statistic just 12% of journeys in Tokyo are completed by car. Could you just talk about how Tokyo has developed its transport culture and transport infrastructure differently?
I picked on Tokyo because it's A, the biggest city in the world by a long way. And second, it's really the only city that I could think of in the rich world, not the only one, but one of very few that has been built almost entirely after World War II. And obviously, Tokyo existed before World War II, but firebombed, it was flattered. Almost everything there is new. More people, in fact, cycle as their primary means of getting around in Tokyo than in Amsterdam, bike city. And obviously, it's got this huge public transport system, which I think people in the UK or the US often are just dimly aware of pictures of people being shoved onto trains. But it's actually such a phenomenally large network built around that. And I think Tokyo, the reason why it's not car-centric is just an accident of history in a way. It was in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, when the Japanese were rebuilding after World War II. They made a choice not to build roads in this huge way that we did so much in Europe, and even more so in the United States. They chose to go heavily on railways, and they've always had quite strict rules on cars from the beginning. So, for example, you can't buy a car unless you also own a parking space for it, an off-road parking space. There's almost no street parking. If you want to have a car, you've got to have somewhere to store it, but they don't give away the car parking. Similarly, if you want to drive on the highways, you have to pay tolls. And it's not that cars are banned or controlled. You can buy a car, but you have to pay for things that are subsidized or given away for free in other countries. And the result is that people use cars when they're appropriate. If they're transporting a load of heavy stuff, or if you've got a whole family shoved in something, you're going into the countryside and you want to be away from railways, you use the car. But otherwise, you take public transport and you walk or you cycle because you use the transport that's efficient for the moment. And the way it's set up almost anywhere else is that people tend to buy a car and then they use it for every journey. That's where the problem comes from.
I found it a bit of an emotional roller coaster, this book, I have to say. There were chapters that made me feel helpless and a bit despairing at the way that the world has been so completely and inexorably reshaped by the car. And then, just as I felt like I wasn't sure I wanted to read on, you gave me Jane Jacobs. Can you tell us a little bit about Jane Jacobs?
Oh, so Jane Jacobs, I feel like it's almost one of the better known stories. There was even a play about her last year, but she was this activist, this woman who was actually an architectural writer in the 1950s, 1960s, lived in New York, in Manhattan, in the East Village, I believe. And she wrote this book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which was basically a polemic about how all of sort of planning doctrine of the time was wrong. And a lot of it was about how terrible cars were, but really it was the doctrine of the time which was about clearing slums and demolishing entire neighborhoods so that you could rebuild in a more sanitary, manageable way. And a lot of it was at the time when a lot of this slum clearance was going on at the same time as building highways. And Jacobs had this huge fight with Robert Moses, who was an incredibly powerful man in New York. It's hard to describe what his job was because he accumulated so many different jobs in the city of New York, but amassed power. And she took on this plan of his to build. He succeeded in building lots of highways, but one that would have went right through the middle of Manhattan. She fought it, and she really was one of the first environmentalist activists working in that way. And as I get right in the chapter, it's not all positive, everything that came out of the way Jacob was, but she was a pioneer. And she led one of the first highway revolts and stopped this destruction of cities by highway construction.
Moses wanted to have a highway down Fifth Avenue go straight through Washington Square Park, where there's a big fountain now. It's one of the most iconic places in New York. And it's mind-boggling. That's what he wanted to do, but it also makes you think what he actually did succeed in doing in other places with the West Side Highway and all these other highways, which he plowed through beautiful old parts of New York.
I loved stories like that because it did make me feel, you get depressed if you feel helpless and you feel like nothing can change. And I think the stories that you put in show that actually people can make a difference and that things can change which I found very heartening.
Yeah. There's a whole chapter in the book about parking minimums and how these laws that insist that every business has to provide a certain amount of free parking, how bad they are.
Crazy, just mind-boggling, that whole system.
Yeah, but in the last year or so since the book first came out, and the last couple of years since I started writing it, so many more of those have been repealed all over the country in the US. That it's been like a phenomenal success story, and that's happened because people started turning up at meetings and things. And in the book, I sort of say, if you do this, it might work. And I think if I were doing it again now, I'd be able to say, look, loads of people did it, and it did work.
I feel like there's plenty of room for a follow-up. Carmageddon 2. One of the things I did find encouraging was that so clearly, time and time again, you point to the fact that when things have changed, the evidence suggests that people, once they've got used to it, like it and are happier. I'm thinking about things like LTN's, low traffic neighbourhoods in London, the Seine in Paris, the road that used to run alongside the Seine that was basically just very busy, trafficy road that was then closed by Anne-Marie Hidalgo.
And it was her predecessor actually closed one half and then she closed the other half.
But huge opposition to doing that. It was incredibly controversial and she managed to get it through. But I think in the book, the way you tell that story, it was on a knife edge at one point. It could have gone either way. But you also make the point that now people have access to the river and it's become effectively a wonderful park and a social space, and it's really enhanced the city in so many ways that people really enjoy. The idea of opening it to traffic again would not be supported. People generally think it's a good thing now that they've got used to having it that way. And then I love this idea of magnet fishing in the Seine, which I had not heard of. That people are now able to go and sit still, and in the calm they're able to fish with magnets, and all kinds of interesting metal things are coming up.
Yes, I forgot about that detail actually.
I digress, but this book is full of such interesting rabbit holes.
Occasionally pulling out cars. But I think that's exactly it. I think one of the things that runs through the book, and particularly in the ideas about what we can do to change it, is the first thing is just getting people to stop thinking through windscreen vision. There's this continual failure from everybody, from the man in the street through to the traffic engineers who are actually designing our roads, to think of people and cars as almost the same thing, as though everybody automatically comes with a car in their pocket. So there's this assumption that if you close a road, those cars will go somewhere. Or if you make it harder for people you introduce an LTN so people can't drive straight down the street, that they will end up sitting in traffic much longer because their journeys are longer. And what the book is really trying to stress is that people obey incentives and they're actually quite flexible. And so if you introduce a small toll on a road, you get a really big drop in the number of people choosing to drive on it because they actually have other options. Similarly, if you close a road, a lot of people will decide, instead of driving on back streets or whatever, I'm going to take the train. I'm going to do something else. So you get these predictions of doom when we get rid of cars, because everybody has got so used to us having cars that they can't imagine it any other way. And they kind of think, if we get rid of the roads, we get rid of the cars, that you just won't be able to do anything. And what I'm trying to make the case is that if you think about people moving around, how people get from one place to another, you realize you don't need the cars as much. Getting rid of some of them can make it easier for some of those other means of transport to thrive. We don't need cars as much as we think we do.
It was such a wonderful read. It's been such a joy to be able to talk to you about it more. And we're going to carry on talking about it, as I know anyone who reads it will, because it's the thing I love most in the world. It's a book where you read it and immediately you want to have a conversation with someone about it, which is great. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Thank you so much for writing this book. It was such a great read. I hope this is a book that's going to move things on, take people places. Could we get a copy to Elon Musk? Is it possible he might be induced to read it? Because it just feels good. That's what I wanted. I wanted people who were in these positions of power or in these positions of wealth to have these ideas in their heads. And what they do with it then is up to them. But at least I wanted them to know. And I feel like at least now you've written it all down. It's out there. Hopefully it will make a difference.
We were both incredibly kind. And thank you so much for having me on.
That's nearly it for this episode. Sadly, it now seems less likely than ever that Elon Musk will read a book like Carmageddon, but that doesn't mean we should all stop reading non-fiction or turn away from engaging with the world, much as it's tempting to do so. I might not be able to affect US policy on cars, but I am minded to try to start a campaign to do here in London what has happened in Paris and close the road that runs alongside the Thames, currently 4 lanes of relentless traffic, so that we can all enjoy the river and maybe even do a spot of magnet fishing in our spare time. If you enjoy the pod and want to both support the show and get more episodes, come and see what we're up to on Patreon. You'll find a lively community of readers swapping book recommendations with me and each other in the chat group. Supporters get an extra minisode more or less weekly. And at the higher tier, you can join the podcast book club and come and talk books with me in person on the last Sunday of the month, with a recording posted for anyone who couldn't make the meeting to listen back to. This month, we're reading Sparks of Bright Matter by Leanne O'Donnell. Think Hilary Mantel and Susanna Clarke, crossed with Liam O'Flaherty, Lady Gregory, W.B. Yeats, and the Celtic Revival, all expertly blended into a cracking page-turner that's as exquisitely deep, beautiful, and metaphysical as it is fast-paced and brilliantly plotted, said the Irish Times. But what will our book club think? Join us to find out. Link for all the details about Patreon in the show notes. And don't forget the Serious Readers Lamps offer of £150 off any HD light. Link in the show notes, and use the code BCR at checkout. Coming soon is another themed episode, this one on sex writing in fiction I'm calling explicitly literary. From serious highbrow literature to warm and cosy rom-coms, what do we want or need from writers when it comes to including sex in their books? I'm joined by Elizabeth Morris and author Alex Allison to find out. But for now, thanks for listening and happy book clubbing.